The dust kicked up behind Thomas Mitchell's horse as he rode toward the old ranch house. He had traveled for 3 days across the Arizona desert to reach this place. His uncle's lawyer had sent him a letter saying he now owned everything here. Thomas thought it would just be some cattle and a rundown house. He had no idea what was waiting for him. Thomas was 34 years old and had spent most of his adult life as a cavalry officer. He knew the frontier well, but he had never seen his uncle's place before. The two men hadn't spoken in over 10 years. His Uncle Ben was known as a hard man who kept to himself. When Thomas reached the ranch, the first thing he noticed was how quiet everything seemed. The house was bigger than he expected, built from adobe and wood. There were corrals for horses and a barn that looked like it had seen better days. Everything felt empty, like the life had gone out of it. He tied his horse to a post and walked up to the front door. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was dark and stuffy. Dust covered most of the furniture. Thomas opened some windows to let in fresh air and light. The place felt like it had been abandoned for weeks. As he explored the house, Thomas heard a sound coming from the back. It was faint, but it sounded like someone moving around. He walked carefully toward the noise, his hand resting on his gun. In all his years on the frontier, he had learned to be ready for anything. The sound was coming from a small room near the kitchen. The door was heavy wood with a metal latch. Thomas lifted the latch and opened the door. What he saw inside made his stomach turn. 2 young women sat on a pile of old blankets in the corner. They looked up at him with eyes full of fear. Their clothes were worn and dirty. Their long black hair hung loose around their faces. Thomas could see they were Apache by their features and the way they held themselves. The women pressed themselves against the wall when they saw him. They were clearly terrified. Thomas realized these women had been living in what was basically a storage room. There was no proper bed, just those old blankets. A bucket in the corner served as their only comfort facility. Thomas backed away from the door, his mind racing. What were these women doing here? Why were they locked in this room? He needed answers, but first he needed to show them he meant no harm. He went to the kitchen and found some bread and water. When he came back, he set the food near the door and stepped back. The women didn't move toward it. They just watched him with those frightened eyes. Thomas tried to speak to them in the few Apache words he knew, but he could see they didn't trust him at all. He couldn't blame them. If his uncle had kept them locked up like this, they probably expected the worst from any white man. The next morning, Sheriff Coleman rode out to the ranch. He was a thick-set man with gray hair and a permanent scowl. Thomas had sent word to town asking the sheriff to come explain the situation. "Those are Ben's Apache girls," the sheriff said, like he was talking about livestock. "Been here about 3 years now, captured in a raid down south. Your uncle bought them fair and square." Thomas felt sick. "Bought them? You mean they're slaves?" The sheriff shrugged. "That's how things work out here, son. Apaches raid our settlements, kill our people, steal our children. When we catch some of theirs, we put them to work. It's justice." "This isn't justice," Thomas said. "This is wrong." "Well, they're yours now," the sheriff replied, "along with everything else Ben left you. You can do what you want with them, but don't cause trouble in town. People around here don't take kindly to folks who are too soft on Indians." After the sheriff left, Thomas sat on his porch thinking about what to do. These women weren't property. They were human beings who had been stolen from their families and forced to live like animals. He couldn't just pretend this was normal. He went back to the small room where the women were kept. This time he left the door open and sat down in the hallway where they could see him. He started talking to them in English, keeping his voice soft and calm. "My name is Thomas," he said. "I know you can't understand most of what I'm saying, but I want you to know something. I'm not like my uncle. I don't believe in keeping people as slaves." The women watched him carefully. He could see intelligence in their eyes, even through the fear. These weren't broken people. They were survivors who had endured something terrible. Over the next few hours, Thomas learned that the women were twins. They looked almost identical, though one seemed slightly older and more protective of the other. Through gestures and the few English words they knew, he began to understand bits of their story. They had been taken from their village when they were just 17 years old. Their family had been killed in the raid. They had been sold to his uncle and forced to work as servants and cleaners. For 3 years they had lived in this small room, coming out only to do chores around the house. Thomas felt anger building in his chest. Not at these women, but at his uncle, and at a system that allowed this to happen. These girls had been teenagers when they were captured. They should have been learning about life, maybe getting married, having children of their own. Instead, they had spent the best years of their youth as prisoners. As the sun began to set, Thomas made a decision that would change all their lives. He couldn't undo what had happened to them, but he could make sure their future was different. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to find a way to set them free. The problem was, freedom wasn't going to be simple. The sheriff had made it clear that the local people wouldn't approve of treating Apache captives well, and even if he could free them, where would they go? Their village was gone, their family was dead. They were hundreds of miles from any Apache territory they might know. But as Thomas looked at those 2 young women, still huddled in their corner, but watching him with growing curiosity instead of pure fear, he knew he had to try. His uncle had left him more than land and cattle. He had left him a chance to do something right in a world that had done these women nothing but wrong. That night, Thomas slept in the main house while the women remained in their room. But for the first time in 3 years, he left their door wide open. It was a small gesture, but it was the beginning of everything that would follow. The morning sun was just coming up when Thomas heard movement in the kitchen. He had been awake for hours thinking about the 2 Apache women and what he should do next. When he got up to investigate, he found them both standing near the stove, looking lost and uncertain. They had cleaned themselves up as best they could and were wearing the same worn dresses from the day before. When they saw Thomas, they immediately moved apart and kept their eyes down. It was clear they were waiting for orders, expecting to be put to work like they had been for the past 3 years. Thomas held up his hands to show he meant no harm. "You don't have to work," he said slowly. "You can sit down, rest." The women looked confused. The slightly older one, who seemed to be the leader of the 2, tilted her head like she was trying to understand his words. Thomas pointed to the kitchen table and chairs, then made a sitting motion. After a long moment, they cautiously sat down, but they stayed ready to jump up at any second. Thomas made coffee and breakfast, doing all the work himself, while the women watched in amazement. No white man had ever served them before. When he set plates of food in front of them, they hesitated until hunger took over. They ate quickly, like they were afraid the food might be taken away. After breakfast, Thomas tried to learn their names. He pointed to himself and said Thomas several times. Then he pointed to them and waited. The older sister looked at her twin, and after some silent communication, she pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Ayana. Her sister was Nalnish. It was a start. Over the next few days, Thomas worked on learning more about them. He found an old Apache English dictionary that his uncle had kept, probably to give orders to the women. Thomas used it differently, trying to build bridges instead of walls. Ayana, the older twin, was clearly the protector. She always put herself between Nalnish and any perceived danger. Thomas learned through gestures and broken words that she had been training as a medicine woman before their capture. She knew about healing plants and traditional remedies. Nalnish was quieter but had an amazing way with animals. When Thomas brought his horse near the house, she calmed it with just a touch. She had been the village's best horse trainer before everything changed. Both women were intelligent and skilled, but 3 years of captivity had made them careful and withdrawn. The story of their capture came out slowly, piece by piece. Thomas had to be patient as they shared memories that were clearly painful. Their village had been raided at dawn while most of the men were away hunting. The attack came without warning. Soldiers and civilian fighters had swept through, killing anyone who resisted and capturing those who might be useful. Ayana and Nalnish had watched their parents die trying to protect them. Their younger brother had been killed when he tried to help them escape. The twins had been bound and thrown onto wagons with other captives, but they were the only ones who ended up at Ben Mitchell's ranch. For 3 years, they had lived in that small room, coming out only to clean the house, tend the garden, and cook meals. Ben had been cruel but not violent. He saw them as property, not people. They were fed enough to keep them working and given basic shelter, but nothing more. The hardest part for Thomas to understand was how they had survived mentally. They had kept their culture alive in secret, whispering Apache songs to each other at night and practicing traditional prayers when no one was watching. They had taken care of each other and never given up hope that someday they might be free. "We knew this day would come," Ayanna told him in her improving English. "Our grandmother always said the spirits watch over us. Even in the darkest times, there is always light coming." But freedom wasn't simple for them to accept. They had learned to expect cruelty from white people. Thomas's kindness confused them. They kept waiting for him to show his true nature, to start treating them the way his uncle had. When Thomas told them they could go anywhere in the house, they stayed close to their small room. When he said they didn't have to work, they found chores to do anyway. It was all they had known for so long that they didn't understand how to be anything else. The local townspeople started talking. Sheriff Coleman stopped by again to check on things. He found Thomas eating dinner with the two Apache women, all three of them sitting at the same table like equals. "This ain't right, Mitchell," the sheriff said after pulling Thomas aside. "You can't treat Indians like they're white folks. Word's getting around town that you've gone soft. Some people are starting to wonder if you can be trusted." "Trusted to do what?" Thomas asked. "Keep human beings locked up like animals?" "Trusted to remember which side you're on," Coleman replied. "These people have killed plenty of our kind. Don't forget that just because these two seem harmless now." After the sheriff left, Thomas realized his problems were just beginning. The local community expected him to keep Ayanna and Nalnish as slaves. If he didn't, he would be seen as a traitor to his own people. But if he did, he would be betraying everything he believed was right. That night, he sat with the sisters and tried to explain the situation. Using the dictionary and simple words, he told them about the pressure from town and the danger they might all be in. Nalnish surprised him by speaking up. Her English was better than she had been letting on. "We know," she said. "We hear the sheriff. We see how people look at us when they come here. You understand more than you've been showing me?" Thomas realized. Ayanna nodded. "We learn to hide what we know. Safer that way. But you are different. We see this now." "I want to help you get back to your people," Thomas said. "But I need to know if that's what you want. And I need to know if you have family left to go back to." The sisters looked at each other with an expression Thomas was learning to recognize. They were having one of their silent conversations, the kind that only twins could have. Finally, Ayanna spoke. "Our parents are gone. Our brother is gone. But we have Uncle, our father's brother. He lives with the people at the reservation now. If he is still alive, he would take us home." "Where is this reservation?" Thomas asked. "San Carlos," Nalnish said. "Many days' ride north. Very dangerous journey." Thomas knew about San Carlos. It was a government reservation where many Apache tribes had been forced to live. The conditions there were harsh and the journey would indeed be dangerous. They would have to cross territory where both Apache raiders and hostile settlers posed threats. But as Thomas looked at these two young women who had survived so much, he knew what he had to do. They deserved a chance to go home to be with their own people again. Even if it meant risking his own safety, even if it meant making enemies of his neighbors, he was going to help them find their way back to where they belonged. The question was how to do it without getting them all killed in the process. Thomas woke up early the next morning with a plan forming in his mind. If he was going to help Ayanna and Nalnish, he needed to start treating them like free people right away. But he also had to be smart about it. Moving too fast might bring trouble from the townspeople before he could get the women to safety. He started with small changes. First, he cleaned out 2 proper bedrooms in the main house and moved the sisters' few belongings there. When they saw what he was doing, they looked shocked and frightened. "This is wrong," Ayanna said, shaking her head. "We cannot sleep in the master's house." "You're not slaves anymore," Thomas replied gently. "And I'm not your master. This is just a house and you deserve real beds and windows and privacy." It took most of the morning to convince them to accept the rooms. They kept looking toward their old storage room like they expected to be punished for leaving it. Thomas realized that 3 years of captivity had trained them to expect cruelty for any small comfort. Next, he went to town and bought them proper clothing. The store owner, Mrs. Patterson, gave him strange looks when he asked for women's dresses and undergarments. "These for your Apache girls?" she asked with a frown. "They need proper clothes," Thomas said simply. "Seems like a waste of money to me," she replied. "But it's your business, I suppose." When Thomas returned with the new clothes, Nalnish actually smiled for the first time since he'd met her. The dresses were simple but clean and well made. The sisters had been wearing the same torn garments for months, but the biggest change came when Thomas started paying them wages. He explained that if they wanted to help around the ranch, he would pay them the same as he would pay any hired hand. They could keep the money and use it however they wanted. This confused them more than anything else. In their 3 years of captivity, they had never seen money of their own. The idea that their work had value was completely foreign to them. "What do we do with money?" Nalnish asked. "Whatever you want," Thomas said. "Save it, spend it, give it away. It's yours." To help them understand their new freedom, Thomas began teaching them to read and write English. In the evenings, they would sit at the kitchen table with books and paper. Both women were quick learners, hungry for knowledge after being denied education for so long. Ayanna was especially interested in medical books. She would point to pictures of plants and tell Thomas which ones her people used for healing. Her traditional knowledge was vast, and Thomas began to understand just how much the Apache had been underestimated by white settlers. Nalnish preferred books about horses and farming. She had a natural understanding of animals that amazed Thomas. When one of his horses came up lame, she was able to diagnose the problem and suggest a treatment that worked perfectly. But their growing confidence brought new dangers. People in town were starting to talk more openly about Thomas's strange behavior. Some of the local ranchers began making threats. One afternoon, 3 men rode up to the ranch. Thomas recognized them as members of the local cattle association. Their leader was a man named Davidson who owned the biggest spread in the area. "We need to talk." "Mitchell," Davidson said, not bothering to get off his horse. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, making sure to stay between the men and the house where the sisters were inside. "Talk about what?" Thomas asked. "About how you're treating those Apache girls," Davidson replied. "People are saying you're getting too friendly with them. Some folks think you might be forgetting whose side you're on in this conflict." "I'm not on any side in a conflict," Thomas said. "I'm just treating 2 human beings with basic decency." One of the other men, a younger rancher named Webb, laughed harshly. "Human beings? Those are Apache savages, Mitchell. They'd slit your throat in your sleep if they got the chance." "These women have never hurt anyone," Thomas said, feeling his anger rise. "They were captured as teenagers and forced into slavery. They deserve better. They deserve exactly what they got," Davidson said. "And if you keep coddling them like pets, you're going to bring trouble down on all of us. Other tribes might think we've gone soft. What exactly are you asking me to do?" Thomas asked. "Keep them locked up where they belong," Davidson said. "Work them hard and don't treat them like guests. And for God's sake, stop teaching them to read. Educated Indians are dangerous Indians." After the men left, Thomas found Ayanna and Nalnish in the kitchen. They had heard every word through the windows. Both looked frightened again. The confidence they had been building over the past week suddenly shaken. "Maybe we should go back to the small room," Ayanna said quietly. "We don't want to make trouble for you." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You're not going back to living like prisoners. We just need to be more careful about how we do things." That evening, as they sat around the table for their reading lesson, Thomas made a decision. Teaching them in the house was too risky if neighbors might drop by unexpectedly. But there was an old cabin about a mile away where his uncle used to store hay. It was hidden from the main house and road. "We'll move our lessons out there," he explained. "It'll be safer for all of us." As they gathered up the books and papers, Nalnish asked the question Thomas had been dreading. "What happens when we learn to read and write good?" She said, "What happens then?" Thomas looked at both sisters, these intelligent, capable women who had been denied so much of life already. "Then we figure out how to get you home to your people," he said. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He walked out onto his porch and looked up at the stars, the same stars that Ayanna and Nalnish's uncle might be looking at from the San Carlos reservation. The sisters were inside, probably lying awake too, thinking about family they hadn't seen in 3 years and wondering if they would ever see them again. The next morning brought unexpected trouble. Sheriff Coleman arrived with a worried expression on his face. "We've got problems, Mitchell," he said. "There's been Apache raids to the south. 3 ranches hit in the last week. People are scared and angry, and they're looking for someone to blame." "What does that have to do with me?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew. Some folks are saying maybe those Apache girls of yours are sending signals to their warrior friends, maybe telling them which ranches are easy targets. Thomas felt his blood boil. That's ridiculous. These women have been captives for 3 years. They don't even know if their own family is still alive. I believe you, Coleman said. But belief doesn't matter when people are scared. There's talk of a vigilante group forming. They might decide to take matters into their own hands. What are you telling me, Sheriff? Coleman looked uncomfortable. I'm telling you that keeping those girls here might not be safe much longer. For them or for you, maybe it's time to think about other arrangements. After the sheriff left, Thomas realized his time was running out. He had wanted to prepare the sisters better, to teach them more English and help them save money for their journey. But the growing hostility meant they couldn't wait much longer. That afternoon, he sat down with Ayanna and Nalnish and told them the truth about their situation. I think we need to start planning your trip to San Carlos, he said, sooner rather than later. Both women looked scared but also excited. The idea of seeing their uncle again, of being with Apache people, was something they had dreamed about for 3 years. How long is the journey? Ayanna asked. About a week if we travel fast and don't run into trouble, Thomas replied. You said we, Nalnish noticed. You're coming with us? Thomas nodded. I can't just put you on horses and hope you make it safely. There are too many dangers on the road. I'll take you there myself. The sisters looked at each other with that silent communication they shared. Thomas could see they were worried about him, about the risk he would be taking. You could be hurt because of us, Ayanna said. Your own people might think you are a traitor. My own people are wrong about a lot of things, Thomas replied. But they're not wrong about one thing. This is dangerous country. That's exactly why I need to go with you. As the sun set that day, Thomas began making secret preparations for a journey that would either lead to freedom or get them all killed trying to find it. Over the next few weeks, something beautiful and dangerous began to happen at the ranch. As Ayanna and Nalnish started to trust Thomas more, they began sharing pieces of their Apache culture with him. It started small, but it grew into something that would change all their lives forever. One evening, after their secret reading lesson at the old cabin, Ayanna noticed Thomas rubbing his shoulder. He had heard it fixing a fence earlier that day. Without saying anything, she disappeared into the desert and came back with several plants. She ground them up using stones, just like her grandmother had taught her years ago. When she mixed the plants with water and made a paste, Thomas was skeptical. But he let her apply it to his shoulder anyway. By morning, the pain was almost completely gone. Thomas was amazed, but Ayanna just smiled. Apache medicine is very old, she said. We know things your doctors don't know. This led to longer conversations about Apache healing methods. Ayanna would walk with Thomas around the ranch, pointing out plants that grew wild there. She taught him which ones could stop bleeding, which ones helped with fever, and which ones eased pain. My grandmother said the earth provides everything we need, Ayanna explained as they examined a small desert flower. We just have to learn how to listen to what it tells us. Nalnish, meanwhile, was working magic with Thomas's horses. He had always considered himself good with animals, but watching her was like seeing an artist at work. She could calm the most nervous horse with just her voice and gentle touch. One day, a wild Mustang had gotten trapped in one of Thomas's corrals. The animal was terrified and dangerous, striking out at anyone who came near. Thomas was preparing to shoot it, rather than risk someone getting hurt when Nalnish asked if she could try something. She spent an hour just sitting near the corral, not moving, barely breathing. She hummed softly, an Apache song that seemed to flow like water. Gradually, the Mustang stopped rearing and began to listen. By the end of the day, she had the horse eating from her hand. How did you do that? Thomas asked in wonder. Horses understand respect, Nalnish said. If you show them you're not a threat, they show you the same. People could learn from horses. These moments of cultural sharing created bonds between the three of them that went beyond anything Thomas had expected. He wasn't just helping 2 captive women anymore. He was learning from 2 teachers who had knowledge and wisdom his own culture had dismissed as primitive. In return, Thomas taught them things that would help them survive in a world dominated by white settlers. Beyond reading and writing, he showed them how to use American money, how to talk to government officials, and how to understand legal documents. He wanted them to have every tool they might need to protect themselves in the future. But they're growing, Friendship was becoming impossible to hide from the outside world. Mrs. Patterson from the general store started asking pointed questions. When Thomas bought supplies, "I hear you're spending a lot of time with those Apache girls," she said one day, her voice full of disapproval. "They're learning useful skills," Thomas replied carefully. "What kind of skills do Apache squaws need besides cooking and cleaning?" she asked. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "The same skills any woman needs. Reading, writing, managing money." Mrs. Patterson's face turned red. "That's not natural, Thomas Mitchell. Teaching Indians to read is like teaching wolves to use guns. It only makes them more dangerous." Word of these conversations spread quickly through the small town. Soon Thomas found himself facing hostility wherever he went. People who had been friendly before now watched him with suspicion. Some stopped talking when he entered a room. The situation came to a head when Thomas took Ayana and Nalnish to town for supplies. He had been making these trips alone, but the sisters had asked to see the town where they would need to buy things once they were free. It was a mistake. The moment they walked down the main street, people stopped and stared. Children pointed and whispered. Women pulled their skirts aside as if the Apache sisters might contaminate them somehow. At the general store, Mrs. Patterson refused to serve them. "I don't sell to Indians," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "They're with me," Thomas said. "I'm buying the supplies." "Then you can buy them without bringing savages into my store," she replied. Thomas felt humiliated for Ayana and Nalnish, but they handled the situation with more dignity than anyone else in the room. They simply stood quietly and waited while Thomas completed his purchases. They didn't argue or show anger. Their calm strength made everyone else's behavior look small and petty, but the trip to town had consequences. That evening, a group of men showed up at Thomas's ranch. There were about 15 of them, all armed, all angry. Davidson was there, along with Sheriff Coleman and several others Thomas recognized from church and town meetings. "We need to talk," Davidson said, though his tone made it clear this wasn't a friendly conversation. Thomas stepped onto his porch, positioning himself between the men and his house. "What's on your mind?" "What's on our mind is this Apache problem you've created," Davidson replied. "People in town are saying you took those girls shopping like they were white women, that you're treating them like equals." "I'm treating them like human beings," Thomas said. "That's exactly the problem," another man called out. "You're giving other Indians ideas, making them think they deserve the same treatment as decent folk." Sheriff Coleman stepped forward. He looked uncomfortable but determined. "Thomas, I've tried to be patient with you, but this has gone too far. People are scared that you're encouraging Apache pride. They think you might be making the raids worse by showing weakness." "The only thing I'm showing is basic Christian charity," Thomas replied. "Christian charity is for Christians," Davidson shot back. "Not for heathens who worship false spirits and practice witchcraft." Thomas felt his temper flare. "Those women have more true Christianity in them than this whole crowd combined." That comment caused an angry murmur to run through the group. Several men moved their hands toward their guns. "Careful, Mitchell," Davidson warned. "You're starting to sound like an Indian lover. That's a dangerous reputation to have in these parts." "What exactly do you want from me?" Thomas asked. "We want you to remember your place," Davidson said. "You're a white man in Apache country. Start acting like it. Lock those girls up where they belong, work them hard, and stop treating them like pets." "And if I don't?" The silence that followed was full of threat. Finally, Sheriff Coleman spoke up. "If you don't, then we might have to conclude that you're not fit to live among decent people," he said, "and we might have to do something about that." After the men left, Thomas found Ayana and Nalnish in the kitchen. They had heard every word through the windows just as they had during the earlier confrontation with Davidson. "We have to leave," Ayana said immediately. "Tonight, before they come back." "We're not ready yet," Thomas replied. "I haven't finished preparing for the journey." "There's no more time for preparing," Nalnish said. "These men will hurt you because of us. We can't let that happen." Thomas looked at these two brave women who were willing to risk a dangerous journey rather than let him suffer because of them. Their concern for his safety, after everything they had endured, showed him just how much they had come to mean to each other. "If we're going to do this, we do it right," he said finally. "Give me 3 days to get supplies and plan our route. Then we'll leave for San Carlos." That night, as Thomas lay awake making mental lists of everything they would need for the journey, He realized that somewhere along the way, his mission had changed. He had started out wanting to help two enslaved women find their freedom. But now he was fighting for the survival of friendships that had become precious to him. Ayana and Nelnish weren't just Apache women he was helping anymore. They were his friends, his teachers, and in some ways his guides to becoming a better man. The thought of losing them to the hatred and fear of his own community was almost unbearable. But he also knew that staying would mean watching them return to lives of captivity. Or worse, seeing them hurt by vigilantes who saw them as symbols of everything they feared about the changing frontier. In 3 days, they would begin a journey that would test everything they had learned about courage, friendship, and the true meaning of freedom. Thomas just hoped they would all survive it. Thomas spent the next 2 days quietly gathering information about the journey to San Carlos. He couldn't ask too many questions in town without raising suspicion, so he had to be clever about how he learned what he needed to know. His first stop was the telegraph office, where he sent a message to an old friend from his cavalry days. Captain Reynolds was stationed at Fort Apache, about 50 miles from the San Carlos reservation. If anyone would know the current situation there, it would be Reynolds. The reply came back the same day. San Carlos conditions poor but stable. Many Apache families relocated there from southern territories. Suggest caution traveling. Recent raider activity reported along main routes. Will help if you can get message to me. Thomas felt both relieved and worried. Reynolds would help them once they got close to the reservation. But the warning about raiders was concerning. They would have to be very careful about which route they took. His next task was finding out more about Ayana and Nelnish's family. That evening, he sat with them at their usual spot in the old cabin and asked them to tell him everything they remembered about their uncle and other relatives. "Our uncle's name is Cocheta," Ayana said. "He is our father's younger brother. He was a great warrior, but also a peacemaker. He always said fighting would not save our people, only wisdom could do that. He taught us both to ride horses when we were very young," Nalnish added. "And he knew all the old stories, the ones about how the world was made and why the animals are the way they are." Thomas wrote down everything they told him. Cocheta had been about 40 years old when the sisters were captured, which would make him 43 now. He had been married but had no children of his own, which meant the twins were like daughters to him. "He never stopped looking for us," Ayana said with tears in her eyes. "Even when everyone else said we were probably dead, our uncle kept asking traders and scouts if they had seen 2 Apache girls." This gave Thomas hope. If Cocheta was still searching for them, he would be overjoyed to have them back. But it also made Thomas realize how much pain their disappearance had caused their family. To plan their route, Thomas studied every map he could find. The direct path to San Carlos would take them through some of the most dangerous territory in the Southwest. They would have to cross land where Apache war parties still operated, as well as areas where white vigilante groups hunted any Indians they found. Thomas decided their best chance was to take a longer route that stayed closer to established settlements. It would add several days to their journey, but it would keep them away from the worst of the raider territory. He also had to think about supplies. They would need enough food and water for at least a week, maybe longer if they had to take detours. They would need camping gear that could be packed quickly if they had to move fast, and they would need weapons, though Thomas hoped they wouldn't have to use them. But the biggest challenge was keeping their preparations secret from the townspeople who were already suspicious of him. Thomas had to buy supplies in small amounts from different stores, and he had to make it look like he was just stocking up for normal ranch work. One afternoon, while Thomas was in town buying ammunition, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "I'm telling you, Davidson's got the right idea," one man was saying to another. "Mitchell's gone soft on those Apache girls. Someone needs to do something about it before he causes real trouble." "What kind of something?" the second man asked. "The kind of something that makes sure those girls can't send signals to their warrior friends anymore," the first man replied. "If you know what I mean." Thomas realized they were talking about killing Ayana and Nalnish. The vigilante group was planning to take action soon, which meant they were running out of time even faster than he had thought. That night, he met with the sisters at the cabin and told them what he had heard. "We have to leave tomorrow night," he said. "I'm not ready and neither are you, but we don't have a choice anymore." Both women took the news calmly, though Thomas could see the fear in their eyes. "What if we don't find our uncle?" Nalnish asked quietly. What if he's not at San Carlos anymore? It was a question Thomas had been trying not to think about. The reservation system was chaotic, with tribes being moved around whenever the government decided it was convenient. There was no guarantee that Cocheta would still be there. Then we'll find someone else from your people, Thomas said. Someone who will take you in and help you start a new life. And what about you? Ayana asked. You can't come back here after helping us escape. These people will never forgive you. She was right, and Thomas knew it. By helping the sisters reach their family, he was essentially giving up his own home and community. He would be marked as an Indian sympathizer for the rest of his life. In some parts of the territory, that reputation could get a man killed. But as Thomas looked at these two brave women who had become his friends and teachers, he knew he couldn't live with himself if he abandoned them now. I'll figure something out, he said. Maybe I'll head further west to California. Start over somewhere new. The sisters exchanged one of their silent looks, and Thomas could see they were making some kind of decision together. If you do that, Nalnish said carefully, if you give up your home for us, then you will always have a home with our people. Uncle Cocheta will adopt you as his son if we ask him to. You will be Apache like us. Thomas was touched by the offer, but he wasn't sure what it would really mean. Could a white man truly become part of an Apache family? Would their people accept someone who had lived as their enemy for most of his life? Let's focus on getting there first, he said. We can worry about what happens next after we find your uncle. The next day, Thomas made his final preparations. He loaded supplies onto pack horses in small batches, hiding them in the old cabin where no one would see them. He cleaned his weapons and made sure they had plenty of ammunition. He studied the maps one more time and planned their first day's route. Most importantly, he wrote a letter explaining his actions in case something happened to him on the journey. He wanted there to be some record of why he had made this choice, some explanation that might help people understand that Ayana and Nalnish were innocent victims who deserved their freedom. As the sun began to set on what would be their last night at the ranch, Thomas felt a mixture of fear and excitement. Tomorrow, they would begin a journey that could end in freedom or disaster. They would be traveling through some of the most dangerous country in America, carrying hopes that had been building for 3 long years. But tonight, for the last time, they sat together in the old cabin. Ayana shared stories about her grandmother's healing wisdom. Nalnish sang a soft Apache song about horses running free across the desert, and Thomas tried to memorize every detail of this moment when 3 people from different worlds had become a family. Tomorrow, they would find out if friendship and courage were strong enough to overcome all the hatred and fear that stood between them and the chance for a new life. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon. To Thomas, it sounded like a call to adventure. To Ayana and Nalnish, it sounded like a song from home, calling them back to where they belonged. They left just after midnight when the moon was high enough to light their way, but the world was quiet enough to hide their movement. Thomas had spent hours planning their departure, and everything had to go perfectly for them to get away without being noticed. The pack horses were already loaded and waiting at the old cabin. Thomas had moved them there one by one during the day, making it look like he was just rotating his animals to different pastures. Ayana and Nalnish had packed their few belongings in silence, taking only what they could carry easily. As they mounted their horses, Thomas felt the weight of what they were doing. Once they rode away from the ranch, there would be no going back. He was leaving behind everything he had built in Arizona, and the sisters were taking their biggest gamble since their capture 3 years ago. Ready? He whispered to them. Both women nodded. In the moonlight, Thomas could see determination on their faces mixed with fear. They had been planning this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, the reality of the danger felt overwhelming. They rode north, staying off the main roads and following deer trails that Thomas had scouted during his hunting trips. For the first few hours, they made good time across familiar territory, but as dawn approached, they had to find a place to hide during the daylight hours. Thomas had planned for this. There was a small canyon about 20 miles from his ranch, where they could rest the horses and stay out of sight. They reached it just as the sun was coming up, all 3 of them exhausted from the tension of their midnight escape. As they settled down to rest, Nalnish spotted something that made her grab Thomas's arm. "Riders," she whispered, pointing back the way they had come. Thomas pulled out his telescope and looked where she was pointing. In the distance, he could see a cloud of dust rising from the desert floor. Someone was following their trail and they were moving fast. How many? Ayanna asked quietly. Looks like 4 or 5 men, Thomas replied. Could be the vigilante group Davidson was organizing. They had hoped to have at least a day's head start before anyone noticed they were gone. But someone must have been watching the ranch more closely than Thomas had realized. We need to keep moving, Thomas said. If we stay ahead of them, we might be able to lose them in the rough country up ahead. For the next 3 days, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse across the Arizona desert. The men following them were persistent, but Thomas knew the territory better than they did. He led Ayanna and Nalnish through hidden valleys and over rocky ridges where their tracks would be harder to follow. But the constant pressure was wearing on all of them. They couldn't stop to rest properly, and they were running low on water. The horses were getting tired, and Thomas was worried that one of them might go lame or give out completely. On the 3rd night, they made camp in a small grove of trees near a water source. Thomas was refilling their canteens when he heard horses approaching. There was nowhere to run and no time to pack up their gear. Stay calm, Thomas whispered to the sisters. Let me do the talking. 5 men rode into their camp, guns drawn. Thomas recognized 2 of them from town, but the others were strangers with hard faces and cold eyes. Well, said the leader, a man Thomas didn't know. Look what we found. A white man traveling with 2 Apache squaws. We're just heading north, Thomas said calmly. No law against that. Depends on why you're heading north, the man replied. And depends on who you're traveling with. These girls look familiar. Heard there were some Apache captives that went missing from a ranch back south. Thomas felt his heart pounding, but he kept his voice steady. I don't know anything about that. The leader smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. Sure you don't. Tell you what, friend. We'll take those girls off your hands. Save you the trouble of dealing with them. The girls are with me, Thomas said firmly. That's what I was afraid you'd say, the man replied. What happened next was over in seconds. One of the men moved to grab Nalnish's horse. She jerked away from him, which spooked the other horses. In the confusion, Thomas drew his gun and fired a warning shot into the air. Nobody has to get hurt here, he called out. But the men were already drawing their weapons. Thomas dove behind a fallen log, pulling Ayanna with him. Nalnish rolled off her horse and found cover behind a large rock. The gunfight lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. Thomas was outnumbered, but he had better cover, and he was fighting for something more important than money or reputation. When the shooting stopped, 2 of the men were wounded and the others had retreated. Are you hurt? Thomas called to the sisters. We're okay, Ayanna replied. But they'll be back with more men, she was right. This had been just a scouting party. When they returned to wherever they came from, they would bring reinforcements. Thomas made a quick decision. We're changing our route. Instead of going around the Badlands, we're going straight through them. That's suicide, one of the wounded men groaned. Apache war parties use those canyons. You'll all be dead by morning. Thomas looked at Ayanna and Nalnish. They had grown up in this country. They knew the dangers as well as anyone. What do you think? He asked them. Our people know us, Ayanna said quietly. If we meet Apache warriors, we can talk to them. But these white men will kill us no matter what we say. Nalnish nodded in agreement. The Badlands are dangerous, but at least there we might find friends instead of enemies. So they rode into the most dangerous part of their journey, the land that even experienced frontiersmen avoided. The canyons were narrow and twisting, with steep walls that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was easy to get lost and easier still to ride into an ambush. On their 2nd day in the Badlands, they found out just how dangerous this country could be. They were riding through a narrow canyon when arrows began flying from the rocks above them. Thomas's first thought was that they were under attack by hostile Apache warriors, but then he heard Ayanna calling out in her native language. She was shouting something that sounded like a greeting or identification. The arrows stopped flying. A voice answered her from above, and Thomas was amazed to hear what sounded like a conversation beginning. After several minutes of back and forth in Apache, Ayanna turned to Thomas. They want to know why a white man is traveling with Apache women, she said. I told them you are our friend, that you freed us from slavery. More conversation followed. Thomas watched nervously as several Apache warriors climbed down from the rocks. They were young men, probably about the same age as the sisters. Their leader was a thin man with intelligent eyes and traditional Apache dress. Nalnish joined the conversation, and Thomas could see recognition dawning on the warriors' faces. They knew who the sisters were. Word of their disappearance had spread throughout the Apache communities. The leader spoke directly to Thomas in broken English. "You bring back daughters of our people?" "I'm trying to take them home," Thomas replied. "To their uncle at San Carlos." The warrior studied Thomas for a long moment. Then he spoke rapidly to Ayana and Nalnish. Whatever he said made both sisters smile for the first time in days. "He says Cocheta is alive," Ayana translated. "Our uncle is at San Carlos, and he has never stopped looking for us. This warrior's band has been searching too." The Apache men offered to escort them the rest of the way to the reservation. It was an offer Thomas couldn't refuse, even though traveling with Apache warriors would make him a target for any white settlers they encountered. For the next 2 days, they traveled with their Apache guides through country that Thomas never could have navigated alone. The warriors knew every water source, every safe trail, every place where enemies might be waiting. More importantly, Thomas began to understand something about the Apache people that he had never realized before. These weren't savage raiders bent on destruction. They were families trying to protect their way of life, their children, their future. They were fighting for survival in a world that was changing too fast for anyone to keep up with. As they approached San Carlos, Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and sadness. They had made it safely through the most dangerous part of their journey. Soon, Ayana and Nalnish would be reunited with their uncle and their people, but that also meant Thomas's time with them was coming to an end. He had started this journey thinking he was saving 2 enslaved women, but somewhere along the way he realized they had saved him too. They had taught him that courage wasn't about fighting enemies, but about doing what was right even when it cost you everything. Tomorrow, they would reach San Carlos. Tomorrow he would find out whether this dangerous gamble had been worth the risk they had all taken. The San Carlos reservation appeared before them like a mirage in the desert heat. After days of traveling through empty canyons and hostile territory, the sight of organized camps and people going about their daily lives felt almost unreal to Thomas. But for Ayana and Nalnish, seeing their people again brought tears to their eyes. The Apache warriors who had guided them sent runners ahead to announce their arrival. By the time Thomas and the sisters rode into the main camp, a crowd had gathered to see them. Thomas felt uncomfortable being the only white man among so many Apache people, but their guide spoke quickly to explain his role in bringing the sisters home. "Where is Uncle Cocheta?" Ayana asked one of the older women who had come to greet them. The woman pointed toward a group of traditional dwellings on the far side of the camp. "He is with the council, but runners have already gone to bring him news of your return." Thomas watched the sisters dismount and look around at the place that was supposed to be their home. Both seemed overwhelmed by the mixture of familiar and unfamiliar sights. Many of the people they saw were from different Apache bands, brought together by the government's relocation policies. It wasn't the village they had grown up in, but it was still their people. Suddenly, a man broke away from a group near the council area and began running toward them. He was shorter than Thomas had expected, with graying hair and weathered skin, but his eyes were bright with joy and disbelief. "Ayana." "Nalnish," he called out in Apache, then switched to broken English. My daughters have come home." The reunion was everything Thomas had hoped it would be. Cocheta embraced both sisters at once, holding them tight as if he was afraid they might disappear again. All 3 were crying and laughing at the same time, speaking rapidly in Apache while the crowd around them smiled and wiped away their own tears. Thomas stayed back, not wanting to intrude on such a personal moment. But after several minutes, Ayana called him over. "Uncle, this is Thomas," she said in English so he could understand. "He is the one who freed us and brought us home." Cocheta looked at Thomas with an expression that was hard to read. Thomas had expected gratitude, but there was something else in the older man's eyes. Suspicion, maybe, or just the wariness that came from years of dealing with white officials who rarely had Apache interests at heart. Cocheta spoke to his nieces in rapid Apache, clearly asking questions about Thomas and their journey. Thomas could only catch a word here and there, but he could tell they were giving their uncle a detailed account of everything that had happened. After several minutes of conversation, Cocheta approached Thomas directly. He was a smaller man than Thomas, but he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had earned respect through difficult times. My nieces tell me you freed them from slavery, he said in careful English. They tell me you treated them with honor and risked your life to bring them home. I did what anyone should have done, Thomas replied. Cocheta studied Thomas's face for a long moment. No, he said finally. You did what few white men would have done. You did what a good man does. Then, to Thomas's surprise, Cocheta embraced him the same way he had embraced his nieces. You have given me back my family, he said. That makes you family, too. Over the next few hours, Thomas learned more about life on the San Carlos reservation than he had known from all the government reports he had read. The conditions were harsh, just as his friend Captain Reynolds had warned. The Apache people had been forced to give up their traditional way of life and live on land that was barely suitable for farming. Many of the men who had once been proud warriors now worked as scouts for the army or laborers for white-owned businesses. The women struggled to maintain their cultural traditions while adapting to new ways of living. Children attended government schools where they were forbidden to speak Apache or practice their ancestral customs. But despite all these hardships, Thomas saw something remarkable in the Apache community. They had maintained their strength, their family bonds, and their sense of identity. They had found ways to preserve what mattered most while adapting to circumstances beyond their control. Cocheta explained some of this during a long conversation they had that evening around his campfire. The government thinks they have defeated us by putting us on this reservation, he said, but they don't understand that Apache strength doesn't come from the land we live on. It comes from our people, our families, our traditions. As long as we have those things, we are still Apache. Thomas was impressed by this wisdom, but he also saw the pain in Cocheta's eyes. The older man had lost so much over the years: his brother and sister-in-law in the raid that captured the twins, his traditional hunting grounds, his freedom to live according to Apache customs. I searched for Ayanna and Nalnish for 3 years, Cocheta continued. I asked every trader, every scout, every friendly Apache I met if they had seen 2 twin sisters. Most people told me they were probably dead, that I should accept their loss and move on, but I couldn't give up hope. They never gave up hope either, Thomas said. They kept their culture alive even in captivity. They took care of each other and waited for the day when they could come home. Cocheta smiled sadly. Home. This place is not the home they remember. Their real home is gone, destroyed by the same people who captured them, but we will make a new home here together. As the evening continued, Thomas began to understand the difficult choice that Ayanna and Nalnish were facing. They had dreamed of coming home for 3 years, but the home they found was not the one they had left. The reservation was safe, but it was also confining. They would be with their people, but they would also be dependent on government rations and subject to government rules. Later that night, Cocheta approached Thomas with a question that surprised him. My nieces tell me you taught them to read and write English, he said. Is this true? Yes, Thomas replied. I thought it might help them survive in a world dominated by white settlers. Cocheta nodded thoughtfully. You were wise to do this. Here on the reservation, we need people who can read government documents, who can understand the white man's laws and speak his language. Would you consider staying to teach others? Thomas was stunned by the offer. He had expected to say goodbye to the sisters and figure out what to do with the rest of his life. He hadn't considered the possibility of staying with the Apache people. I don't know if I would be welcome here, Thomas said. I'm still a white man in Apache territory. You are a white man who freed Apache slaves and brought them home at great risk to yourself, Cocheta replied. You are a white man who learned Apache customs and showed respect for our ways. That makes you different from other white men. That night, as Thomas lay in the dwelling Cocheta had prepared for him, he thought about the choice he was facing. He could stay here and try to build a new life among the Apache people, or he could leave and start over somewhere else. Either way, he would be giving up his old identity and becoming someone new. But as he listened to the quiet sounds of the Apache camp around him, Thomas realized something important. Over the past few months, he had already become someone new. The man who had first discovered Ayanna and Nalnish in that storage room was not the same person who had brought them safely home. He had learned things about courage, friendship, and justice that he never could have learned in his old life. Maybe it was time to embrace that new identity completely. Maybe it was time to find out what kind of man he could become when he was surrounded by people who valued wisdom over wealth, family over individual success, and respect for all living things over domination and control. Tomorrow, he would have to make a decision that would determine the rest of his life. But tonight, for the first time in months, Thomas felt truly at peace. The morning sun painted the desert in shades of gold and red as Thomas walked to the place where Ayana and Nalnish were sitting with their uncle. After a night of deep thought, he had made his decision about staying with the Apache people. But first, he wanted to hear what the sisters had decided about their own futures. Both women looked different than they had just days before. Being among their own people had brought color back to their faces and confidence back to their voices. They sat with the straight-backed posture Thomas remembered from their first lessons at the ranch, but now it came from pride rather than caution. "We have been talking all night," Ayana said when she saw Thomas approaching, "about what we want to do now that we are home." Thomas sat down with them in the circle they had formed around a small fire. Around them, the reservation was coming to life as people started their daily routines. Children were playing traditional games while their mothers prepared breakfast. Older men were discussing plans for the day's work. "This is home," Nalnish said, gesturing toward the activity around them. "But it is also not home. The home we remember is gone forever." Ayana nodded in agreement. "We have talked with Uncle Cocheta and with other people from our original band. Many of them have adapted to life here. They have found ways to be happy. But they have also had to give up parts of themselves." Thomas understood what they were struggling with. The reservation offered safety and community, but it also meant accepting limitations on their freedom and traditional way of life. "What have you decided?" he asked gently. The sisters looked at each other with that silent communication they shared. Thomas had seen this exchange hundreds of times over the past few months, and he could tell they had reached some kind of agreement. "I will stay here," Ayana said. "My people need healers who understand both Apache medicine and white man's medicine. I can use what you taught me about reading and writing to help our community deal with government officials." "And I will come back with you," Nalnish said, turning to Thomas. "If you will have me. There is important work to be done in the world outside the reservation. Somebody needs to build bridges between Apache people and white people." Thomas was surprised by Nalnish's decision, but as he thought about it, he realized it made perfect sense. She had always been the more outgoing of the two sisters, the one who was quicker to trust and adapt to new situations. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked her. "It won't be easy. Most white people won't understand or accept you." "Most white people didn't understand or accept you after you freed us," Nalnish replied with a slight smile. "But you did what was right anyway. I want to do what is right too." Cocheta, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "This is a wise plan," he said. "Ayana will help our people here learn to survive in the white man's world. Nalnish will help the white man's world learn to understand Apache people." "And what about you, Thomas?" Ayana asked. "What have you decided?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I've decided to stay," he said. "At least for a while. Cocheta has offered to let me help teach English and reading to anyone who wants to learn. I think I can be useful here." Both sisters smiled, but Thomas could see different emotions in their eyes. Ayana looked pleased that he would be staying to help their people. Nalnish looked sad that they would be separating just when they had become such close friends. "This isn't goodbye forever," Thomas said, understanding Nalnish's expression. "I'll establish trade routes between the reservation and the outside world. We'll see each other regularly." Over the next few hours, they worked out the details of their plan. Thomas would spend the next several months at San Carlos, learning more about Apache culture and helping establish a school where children could learn both Apache traditions and practical skills for dealing with white society. Nalnish would return with him to the outside world, where Thomas would help her find work as a translator and cultural guide. She could help government officials understand Apache concerns, and she could help Apache people navigate the complex world of white laws and customs. But first, there was something important they needed to do. Cocheta announced that the tribe would hold a special ceremony to formally adopt Thomas as a member of their extended family. It would be a recognition of what he had done for Ayana and Nalnish, and it would give him a place of honor in their community. The ceremony took place that evening, with the entire camp gathering around a large fire. Thomas had never experienced anything like it. There was singing and dancing that seemed to connect the present moment to thousands of years of Apache history. There were prayers that honored the spirits of the land and the ancestors who had come before. When it came time for Thomas to speak, he struggled to find words that could express what this meant to him. 3 months ago, I thought I was just inheriting a ranch, he said. I had no idea I was about to inherit 2 sisters, a new family, and a completely different understanding of what it means to be human. He turned to look at Ayana and Nalnish, who were sitting with their uncle and smiling through tears. These women taught me that freedom isn't something you give to people, Thomas continued. It's something that belongs to them already. Something that can never really be taken away no matter what happens to their bodies or their circumstances. The crowd murmured approval, and Thomas could see that his words were being translated for those who didn't speak English. They also taught me that family isn't about blood, he went on. It's about choosing to care for each other even when it's difficult or dangerous. Tonight you have chosen to make me part of your family. I promise to honor that gift for the rest of my life. As the ceremony continued into the night, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his place in the world, not as a cavalry officer or a ranch owner, but as a bridge between 2 communities that needed to understand each other better. Years later, when people asked Thomas about the most important decision he had ever made, he would always tell them about the morning he chose to set 2 Apache sisters free instead of keeping them as slaves. But what he learned over time was that the decision had really set him free too. Ayana became one of the most respected healers on the San Carlos reservation. Combining traditional Apache medicine with knowledge she gained from medical books Thomas helped her read. She married a fellow healer and raised children who were proud of their Apache heritage, but also prepared for life in a changing world. Nalnish traveled throughout the Southwest, working as a translator and negotiator in disputes between Apache communities and white settlers. Her patient wisdom prevented numerous conflicts and helped establish the kind of mutual respect that made peaceful coexistence possible. And Thomas found his life's work in education, establishing schools that honored both Apache culture and practical skills needed for survival in modern America. He never returned to his old way of life, never regretted the ranch he had abandoned or the community that had rejected him, because he had discovered something more valuable than land or social acceptance. He had discovered what it meant to choose love over fear, justice over convenience, and human dignity over cultural prejudice. The story that began with slavery ended with freedom. But more than that, it showed how one person's choice to do what was right could create ripples that changed entire communities for generations to come. In a time when hatred seemed stronger than hope, 3 people proved that friendship could overcome any barrier if it was built on respect, courage, and an unshakable belief in the equal worth of every human soul.